Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to create a fun and relaxing woodland doodle that I'm going to paint all freehand. I'm going to go straight to the colors. Firstly, this is Burnt Umber by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, and I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. For a bit of golden accent, I'm going to use this one gold color from my Finetec Gold palette. Let's begin. I'm going to start by activating some colors on my palette. There's a bit of Terre Verde, and on the left I added some Vermilion. I also have a bit of Permanent Yellow Deep on the right hand side, and at the bottom I'm going to have Indigo mixed with Terre Verde. For the first one, I'm going to paint a pine tree right at the center, and I'm going to paint this in a few sections. At the top, I used Terre Verde mixed with Indigo. Then as I get towards the bottom, I added more Permanent Yellow Deep for a lighter yellow-green. For the section right at the bottom, I added even more Permanent Yellow Deep, so you can see the gradual change in color. I also added a little bit of vermilion on the left. I just dotted in the damp surface. Then as for the stem, I'm going to use a mix of indigo and burnt umber for a rich dark brown with added vermilion to add some warmth to the tone. For the next tree, I want the color to look a bit more pastel, so I added some Jaune Brilliant Dark into the previous greens. This has a bit of Terre Verde with a touch of Permanent Yellow Deep and Vermilion as well. Then I like to take bits of the different hues to create some variations to the color as I'm painting circles to represent the clumps of leaves on the tree. For this one, while the surface is still damp, I'm going to take off a little bit of paint at the center for the stem. I added a little bit of water to the center and then I picked off the excess using my tissue. I'm going to paint another pine tree here, this time in a different way. For the color I used indigo with Terre Verde and Jaune Brilliant Dark, and I'm also sectioning them out as triangles this time. As I get towards the bottom, I added light pastel green for the color variation. Once the second tree is completely dry, I'm going to paint the stem. My brush was still a little bit dirty. It has a bit of the Jaune Brilliant Dark, but that's okay. I also like a little bit of variation to the brown as well. Because there's a little bit of space, I'm going to add some branches as well. And I just find that adding little details like this makes the tree look cuter. For the next one, I'm going to try something a bit different. I'm going to start with the stem and the branches first, and I also added some vermilion as well as Jaune Brilliant Dark into the brown mixture, so it's a bit more reddish and lighter. For the branches, I'm also going to curve them so it looks different to the one that I previously painted. While I wait for these branches to dry, I'm also going to paint the stem of the previous pine tree. I used the same mixture with added vermilion in a thicker consistency, and this time I'm just going to paint over the leaves. Now I'm going to go back to the previous stem and branches, and this time I decided to add some line textures following the curvature and the lines. I also added more indigo into the previous mixture so the brown becomes this rich dark brown again. For the lines, they are quite thin, so you can use a smaller brush for this, but I was kind of lazy when I was doodling this and I just wanted to enjoy the process, so I decided to stick with just one brush for the whole doodle. For the color of the tree, I decided to just use the greens that I've already pre-mixed on my palette, and I just added more Permanent Yellow Deep and also a little bit of vermilion, so this becomes a bit more earthy. I'm also going to switch up the green using the bluish green at the bottom of my palette here. With these types of doodles, I don't really care so much about specific colors. I just want to play with it and create different variations. I guess it's a little bit more experimental and playful, so feel free to play around with different hues as well. You don't have to stick with different variations of greens. You can even turn these into flowery trees if you would like. But personally, I just wanted to do something simple, so I'm just going to stick with the greens. I used either Terre Verte or a mix of indigo and permanent yellow deep as the main greens. Then I can either play with the ratio or add different hues in order to play with the color mixtures. On top of painting trees, I feel like adding bushes as well. This way I can play a bit more with the space as well as the height of the elements. While the surface is still damp is the perfect time to add different hues for some fun color variations, and you can also watch the color spread naturally by itself. So I think that's all there is to it at this stage. I'm just going to play with different organic shapes in order to create different types of trees, bushes, or plants in general to fill the main space that I have. In addition to the small bushy bushes, I like to also bunch large leaf shapes together as well. You can also do this with different leaf shapes or even ferns for your composition, just as extra ideas if you would like. For the stems, you don't have to stick with the brown mixtures that I've shown you earlier. Here I'm using a mix with more indigo for a dark blue stem and branches, so don't be scared to play with different colors and just have fun with this one. The shapes of the stems and branches are also something that I like to paint differently for fun. I like to imagine different shapes and how the trees grow, or maybe just doodle something that doesn't even make too much sense either, because I think that's what's fun about doodling and painting. You can basically just make anything you can think of. By the way, these are just the shapes of the trees I can think of at that moment as I was painting, but you can paint different shapes as well if you can think of any others on top of the ones that I've shown you today. At this point, the space is getting a little bit tight and awkward to add other trees without making them super small or super short compared to everything else. So I decided to include other elements which can be a bit more fluid and organic in terms of the shapes to fill in the random spaces. I like to paint single leaves and ferns, and also add some berries for extra pop of color. These are basically the fillers of the doodle, but you can also add other things like twigs, wild berries, or even animals if you would like. I think adding little bears or deer in between the trees would make this look so cute, but I'm so bad at painting them, and this piece is just something that I want to relax to, so I avoided painting something that might cause a bit of stress for me. However, if you're good with animals and enjoy painting them, feel free to include them in. You can paint them a little bit smaller so it looks like they're roaming in between the large trees in the woods. If you're a beginner or new to watercolors, just a heads up for the smaller elements like the leaves and berries, try to use a light load on your brush so the paint isn't dripping from your bristles. This way when you're painting the small shapes, the paint doesn't puddle up. When they do, it takes longer for them to dry, and you might also risk smudging them as you're painting other areas. I still do this as well sometimes, so make sure you use your tissue to take off extra paint from your bristles or from your paper if you've already applied paint like what I did with the berries. After I've taken them off, you can see that the color becomes lighter, so I just reapplied the paint using a lighter brush load and a thicker consistency. I'm also going to add blueberries, and for this I'm going to use indigo. For the blueberries, since the color is darker, I'm going to leave a little bit of white space for the highlights, but you don't have to do this. This is optional since you can still add on the highlights using bleed-proof white later on. Okay, I think I filled the space pretty well, so now I'm going to doodle on some details to the trees and the leaves. You can be as creative as you want with this. I just like to keep it simple, like doing dashed lines, little curves, and things like that. And I'm just going to play around with my watercolors using and adding on to the colors that I've already pre-mixed on my palette. For the lighter trees, I like using darker colors for the little textures and details, and as for the darker colored trees, I like to use bleed-proof white so there's a better contrast with the colors. But with these doodles, I find that using mixed medium, like adding colored pencils, will also add a nice touch to the texture. Personally, I'm just going to keep it simple and use the colors that I already have, but I'm just sharing options in case you want to play and experiment further with yours if you decide to paint along. By the way, what I meant before with the darker colors when I'm adding on the detail is more about using a thick consistency of a certain color. Generally, the base of the wash of the trees is done in a light to medium consistency, so by painting in a thicker consistency on top, the color should still stand out against the base. As an example, for this leaf, I'm using a mid-tone green, which isn't too dark, but since I'm using a thick consistency against the washed out leaves, the detail still stands out. By the way, you can also use a small brush for this, so it's much easier to control the lines, and make sure you're using a light load on your brush with a thicker consistency. After this, I'm going to move on to add the details for the berries. They look fairly flat and the colors have faded, so I'm going to follow this up with a thicker consistency of indigo since the base color is also indigo, but you can see that the color has faded, and I'm just going to paint a thicker consistency to follow the curvature at the bottom so it looks a little bit more plump and three-dimensional. For the red though, I added a bit of burnt umber into the vermilion. And for the highlights, if you didn't leave out any white space, you can also use bleed-proof white to make them look shiny. Once I've painted the berries, I felt like the composition still needs a bit more color, so I used a thick consistency of vermilion to add more berries in between some of the leaves. Initially, I wanted to finish the composition here, but I felt like adding some gold to the composition just for fun, so I'm going to just make some curved scribbles and dots in between some of the spaces with a thick consistency of gold. You can also add gold details to the trees or other elements, and that's basically it for this doodle. I love painting this one, it was so relaxing and fun. And if you like this content, feel free to subscribe for more like this. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!